Now with a very quick introduction I do want to mention to everyone that this meeting is being recorded so that we can post it on later and make the slides available as well. I also want you to know that it is being closed captioned. So if you would appreciate closed captioning, please turn that on simultaneously. My name is Barbara Beerer. I'm the faculty director of the MRCT Center, the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital in Harvard. And I welcome you to this launch, which we're really thrilled to be doing, to speak today about IRB efforts to advance diversity inclusion in clinical research and present some of the challenges and the reasons for doing this, but then also importantly, tools and resources that we and others have developed that might make the work somewhat easier. So next slide, please. Here's our disclaimer. None of this represents the opinions of our employers or our institutions. We are supported by voluntary contributions and grants, which you can see from whom, and we are committed to autonomy in our research. Everything we show is supported by or under the Creative Commons License 4.0, and you can see it there. So next slide. So for those of you who don't know, go back one. I will be introducing Ivy Tillman, the Director of Research Operations at Mayo Clinic, who will be speaking after me, and Laura Maloney, the Program Director for DE&I at the MRCT Center, who will introduce the tools and resources. So you'll be hearing from them after my introduction, and we look forward to your contributions. I also want to say as we go forward, please do put your questions into the Q&A. If you preferably, because we will be able to get to them, but feel free also to chat so that we can record your comments and suggestions to the work we're doing. Could I have the next slide? For those of you who don't know, the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center is a research and policy center at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard that really looks at the integrity, safety, and rigor of international multi-site and clinical trials. And we do that work by engaging diverse stakeholders, that's from industry, academia, patient advocates, regulatory partners, nonprofit partners, and others, to really define emerging issues in international clinical trials, not to write a white paper about all the problems, but then to move forward to really try to create and use the relevant expertise to create ethical, actionable, and practical solutions, thinking that if it all works for everyone around that table, that it has a much greater chance of success. Could I have the next slide, please? So we've been involved in diversity, inclusion, and equity with a specific focus in clinical research for probably the last 6 or 7 years. You can see some of the work we've done on the website, as well as we've put it together in a rather large guidance and toolkit. And could I have the next slide? Click. The toolkit is also available on the web, and you'll see that it has various sort of suggestions and tools and resources that you can use. We've gone on, next slide, to have a series of webinars dating back 2 years ago, and then a second set of webinars last year as well. Next slide. We've done some education and thinking about equity and design in clinical research. And that course will be available for free on our website in about a month. It's a series of 6 lectures and discussions that covers the gamut of sort of how to think about DE&I in clinical research. Next. And finally, we've done a lot of work on health literacy, and all of that is available on the website as well, which really tries to break apart how to think about health literacy and culturally and linguistically appropriate materials, which of course is essential to clinical research and to the IRB review. So next slide. So with that background, we really are specifically focusing today on IRBs, ethics committees, and HRPPs, but everybody has accountability for making the changes that they control and for communicating the way that they think about the problems to each other and to one another. Because if we don't all commit to this and are not all accountable for this, change will not occur. So while we're focusing today, you could click on the one IRB and ethics committee. We by no means see this as an IRB problem. We see IRBs and HRPPs as part of the solution. But we have in the documents and in other work we're doing focused on each of these stakeholders to really think about how to commit and how to measure, how to track, and how to continue to make the changes that we need to see. Could I have the next slide? So with that background, we started thinking about what's the role of the IRB and does the IRB have a role in this? And certainly the regulatory foundations at the common rule says specifically that the selection of subjects is equitable, which means that there's fairness in the distribution of the benefits of research, a justice principle. That's and that there is beneficence and respect for persons also apply, not only justice issues, all detailed in the Belmont report. And while we have traditionally thought about protection of vulnerable populations and marginalized populations, I think we now all appreciate, next slide, that there is an equal commitment to inclusion, and that balancing this effort to protection and inclusion is something that we are now much more focused on and need to think about in terms of our role as investigators, as institutions, as sponsors, and as ethics committees. Next slide. It's also true that there is a call to health literate and translated materials by both the Common Rule and the FDA in the US and elsewhere appropriately, that the information that's given to the subject or participant or their representatives shall be in a language understandable to that person. And the way that that's said, that that the language is understandable, is a commitment to health literacy and translation. Some of those tools we're going to discuss today, but a lot of that is embedded in the website to be helpful to you. I think it's also important to say that we have not yet tackled entirely the translation aspects and interpretation and interpreter issues, but we are actively working on that and we'll come back to it. It's not the responsibility of the participant to understand what the investigator or study team says to them. It's up to the investigator or study team to be understandable to the participant. And we need to make sure that we've done everything possible to make that happen. Could I have the next slide? And finally, in the regulations, both the Common Rule and FDA say that the IRB shall be sufficiently qualified through the experience and expertise of its members, professional competence, and the diversity of its members, including consideration of race, gender, cultural backgrounds, and sensitivities to such issues as community attitudes, to promote respect for its advice and counsel in safeguarding the rights and welfare of human subjects. So really, in many ways, the regulatory regulations support a focus on diversity, inclusion, and equity in the research that we review. Could I have the next slide? David Strauss, Sarah White, and I put together our initial thoughts on this, and it was published as a policy forum in Science about a year ago. And it really spoke to why there is a call for attention to this issue by ethics boards, and how that's defensible and how to think about it. And that was our first foray really into putting this together in terms of what the comprehensive focus should be. But when we started to talk to IRBs and others about this, could I have the next slide? What we heard was that it's beyond the regulations, that it's scope creep, that really by the time a protocol comes to the IRB for review, it's too late to make the kinds of changes that need to be made. We counter that by saying, really, it's sort of the last stop before a protocol is open for enrollment for that institution, investigator, study team, and protocol to think through this, the way that diversity, inclusion, and equity could be considered and thought about as part of the work that will go forward. So in thinking about how complex this was and how varied the responses were from the community, what we did, next slide, was pull together a task force that really spent about 9 months together thinking about how to do this work well, how to do it respectfully, and what changes could we make that were within our capacity as IRBs. Can we agree upon the problem? Is it within the remit of the IRB? What are the limits of authority of the IRB, and what are the limits of consideration? What practical steps can be taken? And that really means what questions can be asked by the IRB for the investigator or sponsor that then makes it an affirmative commitment or explanation for why this would not be necessary in this research at this time. We're not saying how the IRB should decide. We're not making any claims as to how an individual protocol will be reviewed or adjudicated, but rather what is the framework by which we consider this research in order to make sure that at least issues of inclusion have been addressed and thought about. What resources and tools could make this work easier, and how can we learn from each other and from experience? And really, we spent the last year pulling together these resources and tools with the help of the task force in order to sort of decrease the barriers to initiation of this work. Could I have the next slide? Here is this remarkable group of people that have been working together to bring forward the tools and resources that we're going to describe today. And I should say that nobody on this represented their institution, and certainly not HHS or the USG. And you'll hear about that task force, but we realized that this task force was a pretty committed and pretty, sort of a group that was well known to one another and may not reflect the greatest diversity of voices. And we therefore followed this work with a Delphi, could I have the next slide, in order to figure out how to proceed. One of the things we felt or learned from the task force is that the kinds of things that would be helpful to hear about was the institutional support. How can we bring harmony and some guidance to that? IRB considerations in its approach to protocol review, IRB membership, and then educational tools for the IRB as well as for others. And that really was done from a position where we thought less as a watchdog. We're not here for compliance and oversight and to find fault, but rather in order to sort of light the way forward and make that make it easier for people to get on the same page. And really thinking that this was going to be a long-term process, that we couldn't change it without education and evolution and learning what works, what doesn't work, getting the communities together, and that doing that all together would be much, much easier than doing it alone. And that's why we're here today and why we've been working together for the last year and a half. Could I have the next slide? So we did follow this with a modified Delphi to see where the community at large came out with recommendations that were distilled from the task force work. And we have 4 sets of recommendations, one about HRPP and IRB responsibilities, the second about the review process, both for initial and continuing review, some principles on communications, translations, and health literacy, and then IRB membership support and training. And we sort of positioned these statements of principles out of the task force and out of our own work and collected 16 participants unknown to one another until the very end. I had 4 Delphi voting rounds, and amazingly, next slide, came to very clear core recommendations for IRBs and HRPPs, which really range from addressing fair and equitable distribution of the research benefits through inclusion of underrepresented groups to specifying support structures for IRB members to facilitate the work. We reached a positive consensus by the end, and really there was enthusiastic endorsement of the role of the IRB for DEI in clinical research, not mission creep, but core to its function, and that consistent, steady discussion and trainings will help, and that there was support for wide dissemination of these recommendations. Now, I have to say that this is not going to be easy, that there's a lot of work to do and a lot of learning from one another that we need to understand. But we're going to introduce the first pass of tools and resources, and want to first hear from Ivy Tillman, who will talk about her journey or their journey in talking through and supporting diversity and inclusion in clinical research. Thank you so much for joining. Ivy, over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. So I'll be giving you just some practical tips on how I've been able to begin these discussions and some of the work at the institutions that I've worked at in the past. The work continues, and no one person is an expert as we figure this thing out together. It is exciting work, in my opinion. It's needed. It extends the roles that we are familiar with. And so sometimes, we have to really not plead the case, but state the case and the justification for why this is necessary. Next slide. So I use this word cloud for a reason, because when you begin to think about, how do I get started? All of these words began to, well, they did for me. They just kind of were blurred in my head, like, where do I begin? Where do we focus on, and at the center is the IRB, or your HRPP, looking at areas where you want to focus. And so lots of times I've been asked, where do you start? And I say, just start somewhere. Pick an area to start. Health literacy, I believe, is a very good area where you can probably see results pretty quickly as it's needed. But if you look at some of these words, they're all a part of designing really a strategic plan for your IRB and your HRPP and diversity and inclusion. Next slide, please. And so I believe that you need to be strategic for a couple of reasons. This is not work that should be done in a method of what I call drive-by, where you do a little bit and you don't do any more. You just kind of make a splash. No, we want to make a sustained effort. And so that sustained effort requires strategy, strategic planning. I'll talk about strategic planning in a minute. It also does require a level of leadership support and commitment. I'm not going to say that's easy. In my experience, I've had leadership support and commitment, but I know everyone doesn't. That doesn't mean that you don't do the work. It means that you will have to really define the work and define the case and be very clear about where you will start and why it's needed. And speaking of defining, I always like to have this discussion. And as I've continued this work, my understanding has grown. And so when individuals say, we're going to tackle diversity, equity, and inclusion in our HRPP, I stop and say, how are you defining diversity? And oftentimes we're not, and I think we need to. And immediately when we say the word diversity, most people go immediately to race. That's just kind of our nature. But this is broader. Race absolutely is important and leads a lot of our conversations. But I want us to think broader. I want us to think about issues associated with gender and sexuality, issues associated with disability and access, as well as socioeconomic status. A lot of the work that we've done has centered on those who do not have access. And those who do not have access have intersecting identities. So there can be issues associated with race, or challenges with disability or ability, and so forth when we're defining diversity. And then this last block, examining the approach. So we were challenged one time in a webinar by a presenter to really examine our epistemological approach and frame. And I was like, why is this needed? We're not doing philosophical work here. We know we have to do this. But the more I studied, the more I began to understand what I was being challenged to do. And really, it's a challenge to look at what are your ways of knowing and understanding diversity. And so many of us understand diversity from very different lenses. And sometimes we have to challenge those lenses. I'll be honest with you guys, as an African-American female, I came into some of this work thinking, oh, well, I got the answer to this. Now, I know this part. And what I learned very quickly was that there was a lot more to learn. Because of my intersecting identities. So really, what is your epistemological frame? What are your ways of knowing about diversity and ways of approaching this work? You can be pragmatic, seeking, really looking at one particular issue and looking to make waves and to change things in that issue. Informed consent, health literacy is a great place to start. If you wish to start with your IRB membership, absolutely. My approach has been more transformative, to be honest with you, really looking at those systems and looking at barriers and how our systems work to increase marginalization, and ways that we can address systems to kind of break them down so that we can have diversity, equity, and inclusion and research. And that's more with a justice lens. And really your approach will guide your principles. And so this work takes time. This is not something that after this webinar, you can just write this stuff down and then get started. It takes thought, it takes time. And I'll talk about some of that. How do we do the work? Next slide, please. And so I already talked about defining diversity, but prioritizing diversity and inclusion. And so I've had many conversations with folks that, have said, this is good work, but, we really need to get to the work of the IRB. This is the work of the IRB. This is just as important. And Barbara's already laid out the regulations. And now that I look at the regulations, when I look at them now, I see it. I see it in the regulations. I see it in the Belmont report in ways that I haven't before. So it must be prioritized. It cannot be Ivy's project or Laura's project. It can't be, this is what this person's doing. It's got to be an all-in type of mentality. Doesn't happen overnight, happens incrementally. And also really examining your participant population. Who are the individuals that you're serving? And I do believe that we serve individuals in clinical research. And so taking a minute to understand the communities that we serve. Your communities are very diverse. When I say diverse, remember, think broadly. And so I've had experience with urban communities and with rural communities in particular, and understanding who is in those communities, who's being represented, what are their needs, what are the barriers, and also focusing on IRB representation. And we already saw the information straight from the regulations about, making sure we have expertise and diversity. And so I've been in the IRB world for a little while, and we always check the box, we have that non-affiliated member, we have that non-scientific member, we're good. But what population is that member representing? What diverse experiences are they bringing to the table? And not only with our non-affiliated members, but let's think about our affiliated members as well. We have clinicians, we have individuals within our universities and organizations who are able to speak to diversity in ways that we may not be using that expertise. And so one way that you can do that is actually begin to have these conversations with your IRBs. Don't go in making assumptions. Sometimes we're really good at looking at someone and kind of categorizing them. And I ask us not to do that, to actually have those conversations with our IRBs and speak with your members, have them do an assessment and let their areas of expertise. Which populations do they feel that they can represent? I think it's really important. Next slide, please. And so speaking of guiding principles, we've talked about the Belmont report and how all aspects of the Belmont report, you really do focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion when you begin to look at it. Those of you who've known me for a while know that justice is where I sit. And so I'm really looking at, where's your framework? I love the illustration on the right because it says, inequality, we understand what inequality is. And sometimes when we're making situations equal or equitable, we're still not addressing the root cause. And so for me, the work that I do really looks at the root causes, those systems. And I can tell you that challenges me. It also challenges a lot of folks. Because remember, we've thought of diversity from our lens and our experience, and now we're having to broaden that and think of many different aspects. Next slide, please. So I'll tell you up front, it's a shift. It's a paradigm shift for your organization, within your HRPP, for your community. I'll get back to that in a minute, and your researchers. And for the most part, yes, we engage communities, absolutely. We have researchers that go out and engage communities and do excellent work surrounding it. But to have your HRPP or your IRB begin to engage communities, that's different. And so some of the work that we've done centers on just talking about research with communities, urban communities and rural communities. Remember, it's where my experience is. And not having researchers lead the conversation. And so, yes, I got a lot of pushback from researchers when I approached them and said, you know what, we're thinking about, using this model. And I can go into that more in the Q&A, how I got pushback and how we had to overcome that, but really asking the community the questions. So one question that we asked was just, when you hear the word research, what do you think? And to listen to their perspectives. Lots of times there are misconceptions, I will say, and lots of times we assume reasons why communities may or may not trust clinical research and clinical medicine. And really listening to them and understanding, when you say a certain group doesn't trust research, we need to probably flip that a little bit and say, why don't they? Or how have we conducted research in an untrustworthy manner, and address that and be okay with addressing it. Next slide, please. And so this is where the context of where you're working and the history matters. It matters in communities where there has been issues historically that either have been addressed or have not been addressed. And understanding the communities in which you work will let you know how that community wishes to address those issues. Some communities, there have been reckonings and they're okay with moving forward. Others need to hear you say it, and it's okay. This is the most challenging, you guys, because this is where you'll get pushback sometimes. Nobody wants to bring up things that were harmful or continue to marginalize folks or and so forth. We want to move forward, absolutely, but we have to understand context and history. That helps us understand, for me, it helped me understand why individuals approach research in the manner that they did or they didn't. Lots of times we've encountered individuals that said, I didn't even know I could be in a research study. Like, that's something I could do. And I'm thinking, of course, yeah, it's something you can do. And these were communities where the mantra had been, well, they just don't trust research. And really what I learned was that they didn't know that they could be a part of research, which I thought was really interesting and fascinating. So spend some time understanding context and history. Next slide, please. And then do the work. So I've been in groups where a lot of the work involved reading and talking about the problems. That's not where I want to live. A lot of the times I love to research and learn, but I'm ready to put my feet on the ground and get going. And so you have to be willing to start. It may look like you at first, really justifying the reasons for with your IRB chairs, with your IRB members, with your institutional officials. This work requires some self-reflection. Like I said earlier, I thought I had at least my identity figured out and learned very quickly that I needed to learn a lot more. Read, observe, and prepare. And there was a speaker about a year ago that I heard, and so I cannot take the credit. Dr. Dorothea Walker said, do your homework. And so that challenged me, do your homework. And oftentimes when I'm speaking with researchers or individuals who are doing community engagement, I'll ask them, have you read this article or have you read this book, or is there anything that you can give me to help me understand more? And be okay with being uncomfortable. We have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. We're going to have uncomfortable conversations. We're going to be in uncomfortable context sometimes. That doesn't mean that we don't do the work. It means that we push through. Be transparent and acknowledge this makes me feel uncomfortable. I've not had to talk about this in a setting like this before. One thing in my past experience that I learned from this work as we were engaging the community and beginning to engage our IRB and researchers within our own HRPP office, we began to have really rich conversations surrounding diversity. So the individuals who were protecting those in research were beginning to have those conversations that we should have had a long time ago, but because we opened that door, we were able then to lay some things out on the table, and it was rich. And make sure you're dialoguing with your stakeholder groups. For us, that looked like our health system, getting engaged with our patient and family-centered care group and making sure that we tap on those groups. Definitely getting involved with our researchers, understanding our organizational needs. We connected with our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. We wanted to make sure that we were partnering with them, that we were leaning on the experts as we walked through this. As well, understand your organization's strategic plan and find out where diversity, equity, and inclusion sits or where it doesn't. We were able to leverage diversity, equity, and inclusion in our organizations and then use that to build upon for research. Next slide. And so one thing that I'm really working on now is really taking a critical lens to our policies, our templates, consent and recruitment, and our applications, and looking at them from a DEI lens. And that requires a lot of work. For most of us, we've written all of these, right? We've written the policies and the templates and the applications. So it may be helpful to form groups of community members and researchers and bring them in to help us look at them and make sure that we're covering all aspects. Next slide, please. And then we just begin. You develop that strategic plan, articulate your objectives clearly, get buy-in, identify your priorities. There are many priorities, and you're going to want to grab all of them at one time. Begin with the priorities that you agree upon, and then establish those measurable goals. And I believe that is my last slide. And I will turn it over to Laura. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivy. Incredibly insightful. Really looking forward to some conversation with you at the end of this. So as I transition into the resources and tools that we've developed to support the work ahead, and some of them are exactly what actually Ivy alluded to in terms of templates and otherwise, but I just wanted to remind folks that our task force suggested a number of ways that we can start this work, right? But the first thing that they suggested that we do was create a call to action by setting out the expectation that IRBs have a role to play in this space. And if we set alignment for action, there will be something for IRBs and HRPPs to respond to. So as we put some of these resources together, we have tools, we have templates, we have explicit points to consider in IRB review of protocols. We've developed educational materials, and we've also stated what are the necessary institutional supports that IRBs need to help along in this pathway. So I really encourage you to visit our website. I think we're going to drop the link into the chat just now, and you can go into our website, and what we've created, we just made this live today, so that's like just in the navigation bar. You can see under resources, there's two options here. You can click on the second option, the IRB and HRPP toolkit, and we have a lovely, eloquently written introduction. It's similar to how Barbara and Ivy have laid out the work ahead of us and what is necessary. But underneath that intro, you'll see two menu bars, and you're going to just click on that first one, and you'll find IRB resources. And once you click on that IRB resources, you're brought to this menu page that has the description of the item on the right side, and then a live active link on the left side. So if we look at the first one and you click on IRB membership self-assessment template, again, these are resources for IRBs. You'll see a showcase example of a self-assessment, a self-evaluation template pop up into a new tab. And so you might be asking, well, hey, why is this important? Exactly for what Ivy was just stating, we need to be reflective and look in upon ourselves and think about, at an annual evaluation of IRB membership, it's probably not a bad idea to think about the diversity of the members on the committee. What are their perspectives? What do they feel comfortable representing? What are their experiences overall? So we've drafted a set of pretty comprehensive questions that you can lift, use, utilize, morph into however you need, but really asking about educational and training opportunities, different skill sets, knowledge base and experiences that IRB members have when they're sitting and participating in IRB meetings. So these questions are like, they're really meant to be inquisitive, they're meant to be safe, they're meant to be an introduction to exactly what Ivy was saying, having those rich conversations around the table of reflecting on what we're feeling and how we're doing this work. So that is available for you. Another thing we've developed are sample IRB and IRB HRPP statements of commitment. And again, this is not to be prescriptive or to force anybody's hand, but this work was really aiming to be supportive in the important endeavor that we all feel around diversity and equity and inclusion and our commitment to it. From our perspective, I think the IRB as the entity that reviews protocols for scientific and ethical integrity, and as Barbara and Ivy both alluded to, we really have an opportunity to hold researchers and ourselves as members of IRBs accountable. And we also have the opportunity to advance research that's going to be responsible and supportive of the well-being of all the individuals that we represent in the community as well. And in that vein, in some ways, we also have to think about how are we supporting IRB members themselves? So are the means that we have available for IRB membership, are they genuinely inclusive and considerate of access for everybody? So in this guidance, we propose the necessity of recognition for all members of the IRB, whether they are affiliated or not affiliated. And we provide examples of how that can be done. So for instance, if we're thinking about affiliated members, perhaps you have their fulfillment of a service that's responsible, that's like, it's the responsibility for their institution. So their service is like fulfilled for that, but that doesn't resonate the same way for non-affiliated IRB members. But you could perhaps provide access to institutional resources such as library access or educational trainings for those non-affiliated members. This document also provides guidance for considering the resources that are necessary to support digital access to get the work done. So we find ourselves in this really hybrid digital space right now, but what are people up against with that? So making sure that members have the appropriate technology, access to platforms and portals that they're able to download, upload, get the protocols, get the review done, that they have the right encryptions, the right safety software, and that they have good connectivity throughout all of this. That's really important to get the work done. This document also describes considerations around compensation, but especially for those members that are volunteers and non-affiliated with the institution. And this piece closes, I think, quite practically with the recommendation that HRPPs need to develop a policy that clearly states the operating or the policy or SOP that clearly states what the responsibilities are of the IRB members. But it also says, you know, hey, these are the approved forms of recognition for affiliated members, for non-affiliated members, and these are the supports that we're going to provide as an HRPP to IRB memberships. And another really great set of resources that we have developed at the MRCT Center and that Barbara alluded to was health literacy training for IRBs. And we recently launched this on the Mass General Brigham's continuing professional development page. So that link is also going to be dropped into the chat. Bookmark it, save it, go back to it, spread the word. It is a free online training for anybody who is interested, but it has particular resonance with IRB members. So really encourage you to check that out yourselves. But in addition to the online training through Mass General Brigham, we've also developed materials that you can download to host your very own IRB health literacy training for your memberships. So we introduced these materials last week in the first session of this two-part series for IRBs. And I think that we're going to drop the recording link also into the chat. So if you want to watch Barbara a week ago, you can do that and check out all of our resources with health literacy. But what I hope that we all know at this point in time is really that the practice of health literacy needs to be applied throughout all the dimensions of clinical research. And as IRBs, we really need to be thinking about patient-facing materials, consent and assent forms, recruitment flyers, the whole consent process as a whole, like that exchange, study instructions or interactive data forms, really making sure that all these truly embody the elements of health literacy. And we've worked really hard to make this, this information, all these resources, easy to use, simple instructions and checklists that you just download and implement yourself. So what Barbara or what Ivy was saying was start the work somewhere. This is a place that you could easily start. So now we're going to move a little bit further, more deeply into the webpage, just checking on that second ladder. And you'll see this one is resources for IRBs and HRPPs to provide to investigators and research teams. And I saw that there was a question in the chat about non-sponsored investigators. Some of these resources will resonate with you. And as much as it's for investigators and research teams, it's a huge resource also for IRBs. I'm not discounting the fact that this is useful for IRBs. Definitely is. Definitely can find some resources here. Again, same layout. You have your master list, links on the left, description on the right. We're going to just go through the first one really quickly. A procedural, excuse me, I got a little too fast there. Procedural and logistical checklist. This is a document that really enables study teams, investigators to think about what are the different diversity, equity, and inclusion elements that need to be considered throughout the research trial in order to lower the barriers of entry for all populations. And while it's a pretty good sweep of some considerations that you might want to take into account, it is not exhaustive. So there are definitely other possibilities. Feel free to send us your thoughts on it. But its intention is to prompt affirmative action to address diversity, equity, inclusion, and clinical research. And this is what it looks like. The checklist, I understand there's a whole heap of information on this webpage or on this screen that you see. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is that we broke it down into pre-study considerations, on-study considerations, and post-study considerations. Again, keeping in mind that we're not asking IRBs to do this, but we're suggesting that study teams, investigators, sponsors think about some of these activities that we've outlined for you. And just a few quick examples. So pre-study consideration, again, I go back to the health literacy, making sure that all your patient-facing materials are created with health literacy principles. An on-study consideration is thinking about, flexible strategies to help participants adhere to the expectations of the research, providing whether it's transportation, child or elder care, or patient navigators, something to assist patients or participants during site visits. And then some post-study considerations that you can think about are, how do results, aggregate results, and also if possible, individual study results be returned to the participants who were in the study in a respectful, health literate, and appreciative way. The next two resources I have for you are related to payment. First, we thought it pretty useful for IRBs and study teams to be able to provide potential participants with a helpful document on what to ask about costs and payment if one's thinking about joining a clinical research study. So this is a quick 2-pager. It's for participants. It outlines, some pretty essential and important questions about, hey, who's going to pay for this? What's the difference between clinical care and study procedures? Who pays for those? Why is it necessary for me to understand if the research pays by a check payment in advance or a reimbursement? Oh, reimbursement. Oh, I need to track my study expenses. I need to make sure I have all of my receipts with me. So just really trying to outline what those practical steps are for participants when they think about these things. It also highlights the important question of inquiring about costs related to injury or harm as a consequence of participation in clinical research. And as similar with all of our resources here, it really should be adapted appropriately to align with whatever institution that you are representing or otherwise with all the policies within. On the other hand, for payments, we also have a resource that is for investigators. So practical points to consider: payments to research participants. This one outlines all the different types of payments. So, whether it's a reimbursement, a compensation, or a tangible gift. It has a decision tree that I will say it took me forever to create, but walks through investigators and sponsors to determine the most appropriate form of payment for participants. So whether it should be reimbursement, or maybe we need to just give a tangible gift. It kind of like has a little bit of a process to make sure that you're choosing the right thing for your study and for the participants that are in your studies. But this document's also pretty comprehensive, as it moves through discussion points on considerations that need to be made to safeguard participants against like research-related injury or undue influence or any risk of eligibility of government subsidies or entitlements. And here we think about, if there is payment being made, is somebody at risk of losing a federal subsidy in a food program, such as SNAPs or stamps or something like this? These all need to be communicated clearly and effectively with participants, but the investigators need to realize that too when it comes down to payments. The document also suggests how to communicate with participants about those payments, about tax policies associated with payments, and potential implications of those tax policies when one receives payments. And the last one I'm going to talk about before we open up for Q&A after, I have 2 more slides after this. It's a final set of resources. We were really excited, actually, probably one of the ones that we're most excited about to showcase today is related to protocol development and design. And it's highly applicable for guidance It's a highly applicable guidance for sponsors and investigators, but it's really a genuinely great resource for IRBs to think about too. So it was with the permission of Transcelerate Biopharma as well as NIH FDA. We took the Transcelerate Common Protocol template, the CPT, as well as the NIH FDA phase 2 and 3 IND IDE clinical trial protocol template. And we applied a diversity, what we call overlay onto it. So you can see on the right side here, it's like your standard protocol template, but it's got these pop-outs that encourages the user to think about, hey, what does this actually mean if I'm applying a diversity and inclusion lens on study population? So it walks through with a fine-tooth comb on, how is the population being defined? What demographic or non-demographic characteristics am I thinking about in the definition of that population? Who is affected by this disease? What kind of resources am I using to define that? It suggests inclusive language, much more general neutral language. It also encourages the user to provide scientific or ethical justifications about study inclusion or exclusion criteria. So I think we're all probably quite familiar with protocol templates. They're 65 pages long plus. So this one has a whole load of information in it. I really encourage you to look through it, to think about what are the prompts that I'm being asked to consider when I'm writing my protocol and designing my study. I don't want to belabor it. I just want to let you know that if we start advancing the suggestions that are made here, investigators, sponsors, whomever is involved, they can really anticipate some of the questions that, one, they should be asking themselves, but two, that the IRB hopefully in time will be asking them too. And then if we all work towards this, we can advance to a more inclusive and equitable research enterprise, which I think is really what we're all here for overall. And so here we go. Some additional resources, stay tuned. Things will happen as they always do at the MRCT Center. We are never done with the work. We have a few things that are coming out over the summer, I think, mapping a strategy for change for IRBs, an IRB checklist for initial and continuing reviews, guidance on translation and how to do that best. Thinking about a recruitment strategy document, aligning it with the FDA's recent release in April of having a recruitment plan, and also the social behavioral protocol template. The ones that we have currently posted on our website are only for interventional trials. So we really encourage you to explore, use, adapt, suggest, revise, give us feedback. We're here to hear it. And then the last slide I have before we open up for conversation is just a little pitch. We have our Equity by Design metrics framework launch next week, really setting out some qualitative and quantitative processes that you can use in order to think about how change is happening in your research enterprise, and that it's really highly applicable for everybody in the game. It doesn't have a single audience, and we hope that you can join us June 30th, 1 to 2 p.m. I think with that, I'm going to end my show. Thank you too.
Thank you so much. This is great. And wish I was there. So there are several questions in the chat, but let me start with the first. Ivy, can you just say whether you've, gotten pushback or, sort of how has the community responded to this?
So the community responded really well. We focused initially on government officials, politicians, clergy, and community advocates. They responded really well. Their charge to us was for this to be sustainable. And so they held us accountable that this meeting was great. We did a lunch and learn. It was great. However, this should not be the last time that we see you. The researchers, for the most part, responded well once we began the work. As I was really putting it together, I approached some researchers and they didn't understand why an IRB needed to be worried about this. They felt that it was covered through their work in communities, and they didn't see the role that the IRB played. And so one way that I kind of connected that was we developed a community engagement steering committee, and then we began to invite researchers to those committee meetings. to discuss their studies, to discuss some of the barriers, and we allowed that conversation to begin. And I think that's when our researchers really started understanding how the IRB plays a role in this.
Thank you. So let's get to some of these questions. So how do we support investigator-initiated research that does not have sponsor funding? Let me start the conversation with saying there are a lot of things one can do that don't require additional funding. And I think that is one of the pieces which we all need to think about as a community. What should be provided by the institution as part of the commitment to access, and even saying that this is part of the commitment to making equitable access as part of our ADA and Title VI, sort of federal regulations, is to say, if you need an interpreter, you can get one for clinical care. Should you get one provided if you cannot afford it or for clinical research? My answer to that would be yes. And that's the kind of thing that a community of researchers together can begin to address with their institution. That said, thinking about the recruitment, thinking about health literacy, thinking about what population do you need to access? And if it's a population that you don't serve in your, local community, should you do a multi-site trial? Should you partner with another institution? All of those are within investigator-initiated trial, purview, and don't require additional resources.
I have comments on this one.
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, I think this is where the IRB actually plays a pivotal role in what investigators are supported to do. I think that, some of the barriers that we talk about for entry in terms of providing transportation, those things become more difficult when it's not sponsor funded research, but that doesn't mean that your study team can't have training on implicit bias or health literacy, or that you aren't thinking about how you engage with the patient, the potential participants in your research trials. I really just think it's like the humanitarian touch has much more resonance here sometimes than what any kind of cash flow can do.
That's great. So, and then let's just take one or two more. Do you have suggestions for how to balance the time needed for sustaining initiated initiatives with this work, and given the limited resources of IRBs and HRPPs? Ivy?
Well, I don't have suggestions for balance. I'll tell you right now, it's not going to feel balanced. And we have to be okay with that. Many of us are starting this work at institutions who've not considered this before. So we will be the ones doing a lot of the work. As it grows, your institutions usually begin to see the need and justification for additional resources. But I don't have a magic answer. And I can tell you that there were lots of after hours work. Number one, engaging with the community does not fit within our 9-to-5 framework. And we have to be okay with that regardless. So yeah, you find balance where you can. Of course, you meet the needs of your HRPP and then you advocate for resources.
And this isn't going to be done overnight. It's a journey. This is something that, you've got to commit to and then map out the plan and do what you're capable of. And in my opinion, borrow and adapt anything that's useful to you. And I think all of us committed to this work are happy to share both experiences and resources as we develop them. And we're happy to continue to provide that link. I'm afraid lots of questions remain, but we are out of time. We look forward to hearing from you. Please do interact with us. Please do email. We'll make sure that we continue this work going forward. And we're looking for company to help us make sure we're doing it right. So thank you. And thank you, Ivy, so much. Thank you, Laura, so much. And thank you to the team, to the task force, to the Delphi, and everyone else who's worked on this to date.
Thank you. It was a
Great.
pleasure being here.